Thank you for joining and welcome to another session and discussion for the Gender and Safeguard Study related to the Safeguards Policy Statement by the Asian Development Bank. This consultation forms part of the stakeholder engagement that supports the Safeguard Policy Review and Update process, or the SPRU as you may hear us refer to it as. My name is Azim Manji, your consultation moderator for this session. This is our 14th thematic consultation topic so far. And this is the second in the series of 5 regional consultations and discussions on gender and safeguards. In today's session, we're joined by Bruce Dunn, the Director of the Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department in the ADB, and also by Samantha Hung, Chief of the Gender Equality Thematic Group in the ADB, as well as Malika Shagazatova, a Social Development Specialist on Gender and Development within the Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department, as well as Zainab Al-Bakri, a Senior Consultant, Gender and Safeguards within the Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department at the ADB as well. All of those mentioned have played various roles in the authorship and preparation of the study on gender and safeguards as they pertain to the revision of the 2009 Safeguards Policy Statement. Other experts will be on hand for the Q&A session, including Zonabel Woods and Madhumita Gupta, both of whom are also with the Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department at the ADB, and I know they both look forward to engaging with you for the discussion as well as responding to feedback. This is our second Gender and Safeguard session, and we have a small and cozy group today, all of whom are English speakers from the UK, Europe, and North America, so we will have no simultaneous translations. This will perhaps allow us to have deeper conversations and proceed at a more natural pace through some of our discussions and dialogues. In this consultation, Samantha Hung and Zainab Al-Bakri will jointly present the main summary issues related to the study they have prepared on gender and safeguards and the relationship of the study of relevance to the Safeguards Policy Update. From the presentations, we're hoping that participants like yourselves will share insights on the potential gaps of the provision and implementation of the 2009 policy, as well as pros recommendations to ensure the strengthening of the forthcoming policy. A reminder that comments received from this consultation and thereafter will not only be recorded, but also be used to inform the revision of ADB's safeguards policy. Before I call upon our speakers, here's a few gentle meeting reminders. As all stakeholders and participants have consented when joining, and as I previously mentioned, the ADB is recording this session for the purpose of preparing a summary of the meeting. It's the intention that these recordings will be available to ADB staff and consultants, and then more broadly, to all members of this consultation publicly. If you have any concerns about this, please contact the Secretariat at the email address posted in the chat box. Please join from a quiet, distraction-free area, remembering to turn off your microphone when not speaking. And during the Q&A sessions, when invited to do so, you may ask questions by either typing them into the chat box or raising your hand through the Zoom feature, and then you will be asked to unmute yourself and turn on your camera so that you can ask your question live. As we're all colleagues here, let's be respectful to one another, and let's also adhere to the time management offered by Zonabel and myself, which will allow us to keep within this schedule. Throughout these consultations, IT support is provided, and you may ask for this support by typing your issue or query into the chat box in English, and we will respond accordingly to assist you. For Zoom, we ask that you use your proper name for our documentation. So to change your name on Zoom, click on the Participants button at the bottom of your Zoom screen, as you can see on the infographic, and then on the right-hand side of your screen, look for your own name. Then click on the More button on the right-hand side of your name, click on the Rename button, and then type in the name, your name, the agency you represent, and then click OK. If you wish to send a message, question, or share feedback, click on the Chat button. If you wish to comment or raise a question live, click on the smile icon or the reactions button at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and then click on the raise hand emoji. When invited to do so, to speak, unmute yourself by clicking on the microphone icon, and then to show your video, Click on the video icon. The next slide shows how we value diverse and informed feedback from our wide range of stakeholders. So let me refer you to these slides. I'm not going to read every bullet on the slide, but a reminder that these sessions are being recorded and documented and will be subsequently distributed during and for each event. And this, as I mentioned, allows the ADB to review, consider, and respond to, if necessary, any comments and inputs made. If you wish to opt out of the recording or distribution of these recordings, please contact the Secretariat through the email address at the bottom of the slide or the screen. And if you have any issues or concerns regarding the confidentiality, potential risks, abuse, or any other kind of discrimination during the course of these consultations, please use the same email address to get in touch with the Secretariat. For this consultation, we have about 2 hours, and here's what we have planned to maximize both your time as well as ours. Firstly, Mr. Bruce Dunn will provide some guiding and overview welcome remarks and set the context for this gender and safeguard study. Mr. Dunn is a director of the Safeguards Division within ADB's Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department. And this will be followed up by the second presentation by Samantha Hung, who will provide an overview of the gender work in ADB, which will frame the discussion and move us forward. Ms. Hung is Chief of the Gender Equality Thematic Group in the Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department at the ADB. Thirdly, we will follow on from the study findings and key issues as presented by Zainab Al-Bakri, a senior consultant on gender and safeguards in ADB's Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department. Zainab will provide us with the findings of the gender and safeguard study that has been co-authored with Madhu Gupta, Malika Shagazatova, and others. And Zainab will provide us with the objectives and methodology for the analytical study on gender and safeguards, as well as the convergence with other MFIs, and then go into the current coverage of gender and associated issues within the safeguards policy statement. After the third presentation by Dr. Zainab Al-Bakri, we will have part 1 of the Q&A sessions as facilitated by some guide questions that will be flashed on the screen. And we'll be joined for the second moderated discussion, also facilitated by Zonabel Woods, on how we can better accommodate and consider some of the issues raised by Samantha, Malika, and Zainab on implementing gender safeguards in Asia and the Pacific. Zonabel Woods is a senior social development specialist in the Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department of the ADB. And these 2 parts of the Q&A session will run for a total of about 70 to 75 minutes. And a reminder that you may ask questions and share experiences in the chat box or through raising your hand using the Zoom features explained previously. And as I mentioned, Zonabel Woods will prompt us with guide questions to frame the conversations for the 2 discussions and dialogues we will have, and these guide questions will be flashed on screen. Please then join us for some quick event evaluations before we turn you back to Director Bruce Dunn to give us a wrap-up and indicative next steps following the consultation. And without any further ado, it's now my pleasure to turn it over to Director Bruce Dunn for his welcome remarks and contextual overview of the Gender and Safeguards study. Bruce, over to you, please.
Great, thank you very much, Azim, and good day, welcome. Thank you so much for all of you joining this regional consultation today on gender and safeguards. Always, it's great to see many of you joining this consultation again from previous sessions. That's greatly appreciated. And of course, for anyone that's joining for the first time, we very much welcome you and look forward to your active participation in the session. Now, before we go into the details of today's consultation, I'll just start very briefly with some background on the update of the Safeguard Policy Statement, or SPS, particularly for those people that are joining for the first time. Firstly, ADB's Independent Evaluation Department completed an evaluation of the existing Safeguard Policy Statement in 2020. And that evaluation primarily recommended the update and modernisation of the Safeguard Policy Statement. But among other issues, the evaluation highlighted the need to further strengthen the integration of gender issues across ADB safeguards, Plus, it also identified some gaps, such as addressing risks of sexual exploitation, abuse and harassment, which is not currently included in the existing safeguard policy, at least not explicitly. So that was recommended for inclusion. Plus, the other recommendation that was more cross-cutting, but is very relevant, I think, to the gender issues, the need for more specific guidance and increased capacity development for our clients. Now, ADB management endorsed all of the main recommendations of the report and then launched a process to update the policy. And that update process is expected to be completed by March 2023. However, we are keeping that date under review, and if we need to extend it to provide additional time for further work on the policy and consultation, we will do so. Now, as many of you will know, we've been undertaking a series of background studies on various different thematic topics, and these are being presented through these regional consultations. As Azim mentioned, there are 14 topics that we've completed so far, and there have been consultations with you from civil society organizations, but also with our developing member countries, as well as our private sector clients and a range of other international and regional organizations. Now, of course, there is a study that we've prepared for this topic on gender, and that's available if you haven't seen already, and we'll make that available again through the chat in a moment. Now, we've of course been looking at many different issues, and a lot of them so far have been focused on what I call some of the more core areas traditionally for safeguards: environment, involuntary resettlement, and Indigenous people safeguards. But we're now coming to a range of more cross-cutting issues, and of course today explicitly on gender. And actually, we're going to be covering gender topics fairly extensively over the next 3 weeks. Today we'll be starting with a session that looks more broadly at ADB's strategic approach on gender and how gender is then integrated within the safeguards. But then next week, starting from the 30th of May, we'll be doing special consultations on sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment. And then the following week, which would be from the 6th and 7th of June, we'll be doing consultations on sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, and sexual characteristics, So we'd really like to provide a more comprehensive look at gender issues, because it really is very critical to our work in the Asia Pacific region and of course to the safeguards. Now, before I turn to my colleagues for the opening presentations, as you've seen in the agenda, I'd just like to provide a little bit more background context. Firstly, as you'll hear, ADB has highlighted gender equality as one of the strategic priorities for ADB. In fact, we have done for many years, and ADB has been recognized as an early leader in the gender space. In fact, our gender and development policy goes back to 1998. And then more recently, with ADB's Strategy 2030, we've included gender equality, or accelerating progress on gender equality, as one of the 7 operational priorities for ADB. And this sets out strategic objectives, targets, and also key activity areas for ADB's support on gender equality and women's empowerment. And this targets how we integrate gender into ADB operations, with our financing, and with our technical assistance. And as part of this, all ADB projects are actually screened for gender issues. You'll hear a little bit more about how we do that in a few minutes. But this essentially intends to integrate gender into project design. Now, then coming to the safeguards, they tend to focus more on the management of gender-specific risks in projects. So there is some distinction between the more proactive work, which is really trying to look at gender equality at a regional level and then at a country level for our operations, and then integration into projects. Safeguards is more specifically looking at the risk management aspects. Now, of course, they do work together and they need to work together. And there's a space closely in between that we need to look at to see how we can strengthen. So in this presentation, we'd like to present both of those aspects, the proactive agenda, as well as the safeguards. And we very much welcome your views and recommendations on how we can consider strengthening the policy, but of course also implementation. I mean, that's really one of the critical aspects for us. So with that, let me now pass over to the chief of our gender equality thematic group, Samantha Hung. We're lucky to have her today. And then of course, after that, we'll have further presentations from Zainab Al-Bakari, Senior Gender Consultant, before going into the discussion session. So with that, let me now hand over to Sam, and thank you once again for everyone joining. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bruce, and a good morning or good afternoon, everybody. I believe you're in that sort of time zone. It's evening where I am, but it's really nice to be with you here today. So as Bruce mentioned, my role here will be to provide you an overview of the context of our existing gender equality work and our approach. And then from that, I will hand over to Zainab to focus in on looking at this in the context of safeguards. So if I could please move on to the next slide. So here through this illustration, I will walk you through really the history and the evolution of ADB's gender in our corporate architecture. So as Bruce mentioned, the Asian Development Bank has had a long-standing gender development policy since 1998. But even before that, and even before the time period that's on this slide, we first adopted a policy on the role of women in development way back in 1985. And at that time, the focus was on activities which emphasized and targeted women as a special beneficiary target group. But since then, the approach, like a lot of development discourse at that time, evolved and progressed to a gender development approach, or a GAD approach, which saw gender as a cross-cutting issue, which influenced all areas and sectors of the social and economic development, and really elevated gender to the mainstream of the Asian Development Bank's development agenda. So with that, in 1998, a gender mainstreaming approach was given formal recognition through the adoption of the ADB Gender and Development Policy. And that paved the way for gender considerations to be mainstreamed into all ADB activities, including our macroeconomic work, our sector work, all types of lending and technical assistance operations. So since then, as Bruce mentioned, we screen all our projects, but the real milestone was that in 2012, ADB adopted the first gender mainstreaming guidelines, which introduced a 4-tier categorization system for all projects in terms of how we categorize our at what level of gender mainstreaming they're at. And that has since become well recognized as a good practice amongst multilateral development banks, and we're really seen as quite a leader in this space. So with that followed a series of operational plans. But today, our gender work is guided by what we call our operational plan for priority 2 under our corporate strategy. And that priority 2 is accelerating gender equality. And so our corporate strategy, as Bruce mentioned, recognizes gender equality as one of 7 operational priorities. And our current operational plan for this, the operational priority 2 on accelerating gender equality, was approved in 2019. So last year, since then, we have updated our guidelines for our gender mainstreaming categories. And this really just more explicitly set out the quality requirements for the 4 tiers, each of the 4 tiers, and thereby the way in which we screen our projects, how we define where they're at on this 4-tier categorization system. And we use that to measure, count, and report on the extent to which gender equality issues and women's empowerment are integrated across our projects. And this is also aggregated up into our corporate reporting. So these updated guidelines provide more clarity also on some of the newer types of project modalities that ADB currently uses that weren't in place at the time of the original guidelines. And lastly, in terms of this journey, if you like, recently we approved new guidelines for at-exit assessment of gender equality results in April this year, and they will come into effect in July. And they describe the criteria for the way we assess and report on gender equality results at project completion. And this applies both to our sovereign and private sector projects. If I could please move to the next slide. So on this slide here, I'm providing a snapshot of the operational priority 2 on accelerating gender equality. And this operational plan for priority 2 recognizes that gender equality is critical in its own right, but more importantly, it's an enabler for realizing all the socioeconomic development objectives of our developing member countries. So this operational plan has 5 strategic operational priorities that are listed on the left, 1 to 5, and they're basically the buckets of how we see the important areas of our gender equality work. So they are, as you can see, women's economic empowerment, human development, decision-making and leadership, reduction of time poverty, and resilience to external shocks. This operational plan also highlights a few key operational approaches. So most importantly, the need to scale up gender mainstreaming across all the different sectors and themes. So really an emphasis on quality and deepening our work. The importance of integrating Sustainable Development Goal 5's transformative gender agenda. Enhancing the way we approach gender mainstreaming in our private sector operations, and that's where we've seen a lot of growth over recent years. The need for more integrated solutions to tackle multiple gender inequalities at the same time. And with all of this, the importance of developing the capacity of those that we work with in our developing member countries and our private sector clients. So in this context, ADB is committed to lift its game to go beyond gender mainstreaming in the standard sense towards a more transformative approach that is aligned with Sustainable Development Goal 5 and also closely interlinked with the achievement of other Sustainable Development Goals, such as poverty reduction, SDG 1, health, SDG 3, education, SDG 4, decent work, SDG 8, and climate change, SDG 13, etc., etc. If I could please move to the next slide, where I will explain in a bit more detail how our system works. So as already mentioned, our gender mainstreaming system is well recognized as good practice amongst multilateral development banks. And how it works is that our 4-tier project categorization system ranges from what we consider the lowest category of no gender elements up to the highest category of gender equity theme, or GEN. And so all ADB projects, whether they be public sector or private sector, are assigned one of these categories at the time of project design and approval and commitment. So the process actually starts from a very early stage of project development and requires gender analysis and sex disaggregated data collection to be done quite early on. And that will inform and support the inclusion of meaningful and proactive gender designs that address the gender issues and narrow the gender gaps and empower women wherever possible based on that contextual gender analysis that's done specific to the project. So for the higher 2 categories, what we call gender equity theme, or the second one, effective gender mainstreaming, our system requires the use of a tool that we call a project gender action plan, or GAP for short. And that is a roadmap tool for how gender mainstreaming will be pursued and the designs and the indicators and how results will be monitored. So this is a requirement for the top 2 categories of GEN or EGM. And it's also important to mention that gender considerations in mitigation and safeguards that we will be talking more about later, these are required irrespective of the project gender categorization. And in practice, how it works is there's a well-established in-house check and balance system whereby project teams will design and propose the gender category, and there's an internal quality assurance mechanism to ensure by another part of ADB, to actually my team, to ensure that the threshold quality requirements of the category are met. So there's internal rigor to ensure quality. Our corporate gender strategy also, very importantly, has ambitious gender targets to make sure that we actually apply this as rigorously as we can. And so there's a twofold target. Firstly, we have the ambition that 75% of our total operations will have gender inclusive project designs. And within that, 55% will be gender mainstream projects. And those are basically the two highest categories. We also have a corresponding target for project completion around gender results. And that is that 80% of gender mainstream projects, or those that are categorized at the top two levels and have a corresponding gender action plan, 80% of those will actually deliver their intended gender equality results. So this system enables us to really measure and report on these gender performance indicators at corporate level as part of our corporate results framework. And we report and track these annually through our development effectiveness review. Next slide, please. So, yes, so Bruce mentioned the Independent Evaluation Department's review of the Safeguards Policy Statement. And some of the findings here I'd like to talk about. So it found and highlighted that the Safeguards policy specifically addressed gender in three main compliance areas. And those are through consideration of females as a vulnerable group in social impact assessments. Secondly, through gender sensitive consultations. And thirdly, through gender responsive grievance redress mechanisms. The report also noted that the SPS and relevant parts of our operations manual have not evolved sufficiently to provide necessary operational guidance on emerging issues, such as, for example, sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment, or SEA. Those issues as they relate to work sites, for example, or broader project impacts and risks on communities. The ID report also noted the need to expand coverage of the Safeguards policy statement to clarify and integrate safeguards aspects of cross-cutting social dimensions, including labor and working conditions, community health and safety, gender, labor influx and migrant workers, stakeholder engagement, some of which are also currently addressed by other ADB strategies and policies. It concluded that emerging gender risks cut across environmental safeguards, health and safety, gender and social protection, and may require a more integrated approach, and further stress the importance of the provision of sufficient operational guidance through the operational manual, good practice notes, and training for ADB staff and clients. So it was really based on this ID review and recommendations that we undertook this benchmarking exercise for gender and safeguards, looking at this topic broadly, and undertaking a benchmark in relation to comparator other MFI safeguard networks. So with that, I would like to invite Zainab Bakri to present the findings of this benchmarking study. So over to you, Zainab. Thank you.
Thanks, Samantha. Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon, if you're elsewhere. Okay, so can we please go to the first slide? Yeah, so the purpose of this study was actually threefold. First, to compare ADB's current policies and strategies and practices of work on gender with those of peer MDBs, to benchmark that the exercise involved benchmarking those practices, especially the policies, frameworks, implementation structures, modalities, practices, and resources. And this involved identifying gaps, strengths, and weaknesses of the current ADB approaches, and significant differences with other MDBs, as well as looking at some of the emerging issues and their operational implications. Next slide, please. As part of this exercise, therefore, we looked to a large extent and quite deeply into the current status of gender within the 2009 SPS. And there were 4 areas that we looked at and that were found. The first is this juxtaposition between safeguards and their aspirational aspect. And what the SPS essentially says is that its specific focus is on the safeguards, and it leaves the broader aspirational objectives to the specific policies concerned, and therefore it felt that this juxtaposition between the two was appropriate. Already gender and development issues receive specific and focused attention in ADB operations through the implementation of the gender and development policy and the accompanying section in the operations manual on gender and development. However, it was found that issues such as gender-based violence, sexual harassment, sexual orientation and gender identity were absent from the SPS. And as well as other aspects that were absent related to the gendered parts of issues such as climate change and labor. It was also felt that gender considerations need to be reflected more clearly in the SPS in order to mitigate gender-specific safeguard risks and enhance gender inclusion in a general kind of way. Next slide, please. So what the study did was that we looked at several institutions, safeguards, which are listed here. So we looked at the World Bank, we looked at the International Finance Corporation, the African Development Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development is not mentioned on that slide. And we looked at 3 specific issues to facilitate this comparison. The first issue was whether there was a mention of gender equality in the commitments of the safeguard policy or vision. The second was the extent to which gender-specific provisions were integrated or mainstreamed into the performance standards or requirements. And finally, we looked at the type of guidance material that was available for implementation support. As a result of this benchmarking exercise, it was possible to highlight several gaps in ADB's policies, practices, and resources when compared with peer MDBs as regards the integration of gender in safeguards. Next, please. So I will go over each of the areas that we looked at. The first one, as I mentioned earlier, is the extent to which there's a statement on gender equality and its importance in the vision of the safeguards themselves. And here we found that it was the Inter-American Development Bank has the strongest commitment to fostering gender equality in the policy statement, in its policy statement on safeguards. And also it is the only MDB which actually has a standalone gender standard. The EBRD also makes a strong gender equality statement, stating in particular that gender is a fundamental aspect of a modern, well-functioning market economy and a democratic society, and that the EBRD is committed to preventing gender discrimination and promoting gender equality within its mandate. The AIIB, of course, makes a specific link to infrastructure, which is its specialty, stating that it seeks to support projects that make infrastructure accessible to everybody. Its policy statement indicates that it will provide client support to identify potential gender-specific opportunities and risks, and to develop mitigation measures to avoid such risks, including in particular measures to identify and address risks of gender-based violence. Now, regarding, if we can move to the following slide, regarding the extent to which there are gender-specific provisions in the performance standards or requirements, we found that the institutions compared vary as to the extent to which they incorporate gender provisions in their performance standards. The performance standards that have the most inclusion of gender provisions include the assessment and management of social and environmental risks, labor and working conditions, involuntary resettlement, indigenous people, and stakeholder engagement. Again, among all the institutions benchmarked, the IDB had the most comprehensive coverage with explicit mention of gender considerations across the various standards, in addition to a gender-alone standard, gender standards I mentioned earlier. Within the EBRD standards, there was a specific focus on labor and working conditions, and I guess that probably has to do also with the type of projects that they support. Both the World Bank and IFC also integrate gender considerations across the different standards, although to a lesser extent compared to IDB and EBRD and also AIB. And here, the two standards where there was most integration related to involuntary resettlement and indigenous people standards. Next slide, please. And the last area where we undertook this benchmarking comparison was on the nature of the guidance material that was provided for implementation support. Now, this is very important. And as Bruce mentioned earlier, this emphasis on implementation support is very, very important. So for the World Bank, after they completed their environmental and social framework, they came to realize that there were certain gaps as to how gender was integrated. And as a result, they produced 3 good practice notes to support ESF implementation on gender. One of them is general, just on gender more globally. The second one addresses issues related to SEAH, and the third one relates to issues of SOGI. It is important, however, to realize that these GPNs are advisory in nature, they are not mandatory. The IFC has a set of guidance notes accompanying the performance standards, but it also has several resources which it provides its clients in order to help them undertake more gender responsive measures in its projects. For instance, there's a toolkit on aspects related to sexual harassment in companies, how to deal with that, how to identify, how to deal with survivors, and so on and so forth. Also, the EBRD has specific guidance, but the interesting thing here for the EBRD is that some of this guidance is actually addressed to specific stakeholders or entities. So, for instance, it has a specific guidance addressed to financial intermediaries on how to implement EBRD performance standard number 2, which is on labor and working conditions. Next slide, please. Okay, so finally, what we did after this benchmarking exercise was to identify certain issues or areas which we felt merited further consideration and which, in the end, might provide the basis for some recommendations to be adopted by ADB. I think it's excellent that all of you are here because maybe you can add to this list and help us enrich the exercise that was undertaken. So the first issue is the one I mentioned also earlier concerning providing a strong gender equality commitment in the safeguard policy or vision. The importance of this is that having this commitment outright helps set the tone for the rest of the documentation and the rest of the safeguards. So it is quite important to come up with a strong gender equality commitment right from the start. The second one, and I think this is shared also across some of the other cross-cutting issues, which is the importance of moving towards an integrated social and environmental risk assessment. This is the trend in most MDBs at the moment. And I think that this is where ADB should probably be moving as well. We've seen that the integration of gender-specific provisions in the performance standards is very important. The extent to which it is done varies, but I think there are excellent best practices from the different institutions we benchmarked, which can also be emulated by ADB. Then, of course, there's the whole issue of whether or not to have a standalone gender standard. We're not saying that you have to, but it is something to be considered. I think we've heard from Samantha on the very interesting and proactive work that is being done by the gender teams. What we have felt, both from looking at ADB, but also from other institutions, that it would be important to increase the coordination and synergy between gender and safeguard teams, and therefore between the do no harm and do good aspects of development work. On learning and capacity building, we feel that there needs to be a renewed emphasis on these two aspects. And I think especially learning the lessons from previous experiences is very important. I think we mentioned, in the paper it's mentioned that institutions should be able to learn from previous mistakes and try to use that learning to do good. One of the examples that I constantly give is that as a result of a complaint to the World Bank's inspection panel, I think it was 2015 or 2016, regarding a road project, this was the first time that gender-based violence was brought up and in the end was incorporated into a specific guidance note, which now helps guide the work of the World Bank on this important area, including in safeguards work, but also even including in procurement. And lastly, the whole issue of having a glossary that and also an environmental and social exclusion list that includes important terminology relating to gender. This is not the case at the moment for ADB, but increasingly we're seeing this in many institutions, including EBRD and lately the AAIB. I will stop here. Thank you very much and look forward to hearing your comments and concerns and I think above all suggestions on how to move forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. El-Bakri. Thank you, Dr. El-Bakri and Samantha Hung for your very comprehensive and detailed presentations and the wonderful overviews on the gender issues you've raised for all our considerations. These presentations offer us clarity and prevent some of the unique challenges which have been raised by ADB's IED or Independent Evaluation Department publicly and need to be considered in the revision of the safeguards policy by March 2023. The performance standards established by the World Bank, the IFC, and the IDB have set a high bar, and the comparators presented will offer us some food for thought on where the ADB will pitch its gender and development issues and incorporate its operational policy 2030, and more specifically OP2, within the revision of the revised safeguards policy statement. We hope we can now get some feedback and an opportunity to delve into some of these issues during the discussion. So I'd like to get into that, but before I do, also like to thank Director Bruce Dunn for framing and contextualizing this discussion. Just to note that if any of the participants assembled here wish to raise a question or share an experience anonymously, you can do so by sending a message in the chat box, but instead of selecting to everyone in the chat, please select send message to only Jennifer DeBellin or Niel Aquino. Both Jennifer and Niel are members of our team working behind the scenes, and they will repost your question to protect your identity and offer you anonymity. So we will now have the first part of our open discussion as moderated and facilitated by Zonabel Woods of the ADB. You will see some guide questions flashed on the screen now, but please feel free to also share your experiences on how the ADB can better target or improve or mainstream gender and related safeguards issues in the revision of the 2009 policy statements. And a reminder that you can also ask questions by posting them in the chat box, as well as through virtually raising your hand, at which point Zonabel will call on you and you may opt to turn on your video, but turning on your microphone is essential so that we can hear you. So with that, let me please turn over to Zonabel Woods.
Thank you, Azim, and good evening, good afternoon, and good morning to those of you joining us today. It's really great to see the diversity of people in this room and the diversity of organizations that have joined us for this consultation. So as Azim mentioned, we have 4 guiding questions, but at any time, please feel free to put up your hand and ask a question or provide us with some feedback on reflection on what you have heard today. So we have these 4 questions. The first one is, what are the potential relationships between gender and safeguards that we need to be aware of? I noted that we have participants that both come from civil society as well as some other institutions such as think tanks and sort of government bodies. So it would be really great to hear from you what your thoughts are on what is the potential relationship between gender and safeguards that we as ADB should be aware of. If anybody would like to start with that question. And while you're thinking about that, I will also read out the second question because I think it's very much linked. So the second question is whether women and girls are disproportionately affected by safeguard related issues. So perhaps you can speak about this from your experience or the work of your organization in terms of if you're specifically working on safeguards or on ADB projects, what your observations and experience has been in terms of whether girls and women are disproportionately affected by safeguard related issues. So I'll stop at the first 2 questions first and just see whether there's anyone here in the group that would like to take the floor. Okay. So if then I will just move on to the 4th question while you're thinking about this first 2 questions. I see. So we have one person who's raised their hand, Sarah Tajar. You have the floor. If you can say your name, your organization and where you're from. And of course your name, because if in case I've mispronounced your name. Thank you.
Yeah, hi Zami. I'm Sarah Tajdar. Actually, the internet quality at my end is not well today, so I cannot switch on the video. So is this fine that I continue with the voice?
Actually, we can see you, Sarah. I think you've turned on your video.
Yeah, but then the voice is distortion. Like if I turn on my video,
it's okay. Yes, it's fine.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, first of all, thank you so much, Zoni. I have heard some portions of the first session earlier today, but again, due to internet problem, I was missing most parts. So I joined again today to have some interaction and experience sharing with all of you. I'm of course working as a consultant with ADB and for the private sector operation department for non-sovereign projects. And for this, in those projects, my role is that basically I'm working with the safeguard team, and I'm ensuring the gender in safeguard documents, like that there should be enough gender mainstreaming in the safeguard. So usually gender concept has been taken in other projects that I worked, that it is something additionality and something doing more is gender, or what we are going to capture in gender action plan. But for the very first time, I'm making very clear lines between gender in safeguard and gender additionality. Gender in safeguard is something related to compliance. It is very important that we must do in the project as per the ADB Gender and Development Policy 1998, gender and guidelines, and all these. This is something which cannot be compromised or cannot be ignored in a particular project. But some points which are related to gender additionality, so that can be that can be taken to another level. For example, if we have sufficient budget in a project, so we can allocate appropriate budget as per the room of the availability funds. But the compliance related, gender in safeguard related aspect shall not be included in a project. For example, we say in gender and development policy that there should be equal access to resources, equal access to employment opportunities. Similarly, there should be no gender discrimination, no violence, and all these. So these things must be clearly narrated and properly documented in a project. And there should be no ignorance at the project design as well as implementation and the monitoring stage. But then if we say that, okay, if we can create more jobs for women, and or we can do some additional packages for better work life. So this is something which we can look to the budget availability, which is coming in gender additionality and not necessarily the part of gender in safeguard. So my point is that whenever we are designing any project, so gender in safeguard aspects should be clearly narrated at the design stage, and those aspects must be screened through implementation and monitoring as well. Because in some of the projects where I have been the part of team in the designing phase, so then the project's gender aspect or gender in safeguard aspect has been a little bit like ignored. Ignored in the sense that there has been not proper gender analysis in the safeguard documents, due to which the team was not aware that, for example, community development plan is a safeguard document. So in that lack of proper or in-depth gender analysis did not provide or did not guide the project design team, I mean to say, that what can be done for that particular community, for women and girls as well, because they have not done a proper gender analysis.
Right.
So whenever the safeguard documents are prepared, so gender analysis and sex disaggregated data, women opinion, women consultation is very important to consider.
Thank you very much. I think it's really important to hear from people such as yourselves who have had this experience of, working in the processing team and looking at the issue of both safeguards and also, the gender action plan. I'll ask Sam and also Bruce if they have any comments on what they've just heard from you. So over to you, Sam, first, and then Bruce.
Thank you, Zoni. I appreciate the observations, and I don't really have that much to add, but I also see some interesting comments coming through from the chat about our approach and our 4 tiers, and the importance of differentiating what is a do-good proactive approach and aspirational approach, which our gender policy and approach aspires to, as opposed to the fundamental requirements of integrating gender in the safeguards do no harm approach, which I think is what Sarah was getting at, in the importance of looking at both sides of the coin. And that really is our approach. It's the gender and safeguards do no harm part of it that we're trying to, through this process, have a more holistic and approach to, and that's really what the benchmarking study is looking at. So thank you, I think, Kame, for your comments about our system. We're always welcome to share more about that if you'd like, and the documents and the guidelines that I refer to are all publicly available documents as well on our website. So we'll be happy to share that if there's interest. Bruce, did you want to add anything at this stage? Otherwise,
yeah, thanks very much, Sam and Zoni, and thanks to Sarah for sharing that really practical experience. I'll just briefly add, I think it's really important observations, and the issue around the need for more robust gender analysis. One thing I would just highlight there is there's a process inside ADB also of poverty and social analysis, which is actually undertaken to look at a range of different social dimensions, and that can feed into both the proactive work on gender inclusion, as well as a broad-based analysis for the safeguards work. Of course, the safeguards then takes it further, and sort of from a broader social analysis, it's then intended to then look more specifically at impacts and risks and how those should be addressed. But that process of poverty and social analysis is actually something that we also have under review at the moment for strengthening. So I just wanted to highlight that. I think that's very well noted. That analytical work, of course, combined or linked to consultation processes, of course, engagement, inclusion with local communities, affected communities, is very critical for informing that as well. So very well acknowledged, and certainly something we need to do more with. Thank you.
Thank you. Madhu, did you have something you wanted to add also, or?
No, I just wanted to say that, very important points mentioned, regarding the gender analysis at the stage of design and how that contributes to both proactive elements and identification of gender risk that should be, part of safeguards, and the importance of gender and compliance, and, she trying to make a distinction between these two at the project level to see that there are resources. I think some points that really came up is allocation of resources also to implement, whatever came up during the process of consultation, as well as participation of women and children. So these are very important points, and I think this these aspects are key of any project. So thank you very much for those.
And I'll just thank you, Madhu, Bruce, and Sam for that feedback. Since Kame, you had a couple of comments, I wanted to give you the floor in case you wanted to expand on those, and maybe speak to your experience with Conservation International's ESMF gender policy. So would you like to come in, Kame?
Sure. I'll just to say a couple additional words, not too much more than that, but just that we're very early on in our ESMF. We've just finalized it and starting to do some training, but we've had a gender policy institutionally for many years, and we folded that into the ESMF, and have found, so far that it's important to have those aspirations and sort of the do-good commitments from the gender policy that sets out, pretty high bar for what we want to see, including, I'll say too, a set of gender tags, as you described, so gender transformative down to, gender blind, and then also made sure that gender was included across all of the other standards. And I'll just say one additional point here too is we're trying to really take an intersectional gender lens. So if anyone wants to speak more to their experience on that, I would appreciate it, as we're trying to understand what that looks like and how we don't lose gender, but we also make sure that we're taking into account some of these other social characteristics. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kame. And what we will do is in the chat, we'll post the link also to ADB's operational plan 2, and also relevant information in terms of our guidelines on assigning gender categories, which might be interesting for you to see exactly how we tag our projects. There's a couple of other hands, Charles and Vijay. So I will just call on Charles first, and then Vijay. Charles, you have the floor, please.
Thanks, Zoni, and thanks to everyone for excellent comments on this important topic. I wanted to mention a few things from my experience in the development of the World Bank ESF. First, as I think I may have mentioned, the overarching policy statement that the bank has, which is called the vision statement, which sets out the aspiration for the bank, does have a strong statement on addressing gender. When it came to the development of the individual standards, there had been a gender approach paper developed at the inception of the ESF. And the view of the gender experts and the gender group in the bank was that because it's such a cross-cutting issue, it would not be advisable, that was the view at the time, to have a standalone gender standard, because the gender strategy was part of an upstream approach, I think very much in line with what Bruce was talking about, the PSIA, to really look across the whole portfolio about how gender was being addressed. Nevertheless, the standards made it mandatory to address those who may be disadvantaged and vulnerable in across the bank countries that we operate in. And it was the practice of the environmental and social teams to address gender as and when they felt there were aspects of vulnerability or being disadvantaged that were addressed. In addition to that, there was a mandatory directive. This is a little bit different than what I think Zainab was saying. There is a mandatory directive that makes bank staff look at the full suite of possible disadvantaged and vulnerable groups, including women, children, the elderly, the disabled, indigenous communities, as a directive, and the link to that I put in the chat. Nevertheless, there were some gender-oriented civil society groups that still felt the bank needed to do more, and that's, as Zainab mentioned, was the development of a good practice note, which staff use and staff engage with borrowers on as and when relevant at the project level to address gender. That also then, there was also one on disability and one on social and sexual orientation and gender identity. The last point I want to make is that I think the most important thing is to be sure at the inception of project development and safeguards or standards that you have a fully integrated approach that looks at all of the risks and impacts to all potentially disadvantaged and vulnerable groups. One concern I think I have is that if the standards start to push very segregated individual group analyses, that the weight on ADB staff and the weight on the borrowers can become quite consuming, and it may mean that you miss the advantage of integrating all of that into the environmental and social integrated assessment, which is the trend, and I think which has been noted before. We did not have a standalone standard on disability or on the elderly, though those are groups that are also potentially disadvantaged, as can be the case for those due to their sexual orientation and gender identity. So I hope those are some potentially useful points for discussion. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Charles. And so I will ask Vijay to come in with your question, please. Your mic is off.
All right, unmuted now.
Okay.
Thank you, Donabelle. It's a real pleasure to join this conversation. So my name is Vijay Thayangar. I'm the Director of Global Aging at AARP. AARP is the world's largest organization dedicated to empowering people 50 and older to choose how they live as they age. We're based here in Washington, DC, and this is my second safeguard consultation meeting that I've attended. So it's been really informative, and appreciate the transparency and opportunity to ask questions. Quick comment and sort of question that dovetails nicely with Kame, hopefully I'm pronouncing her name correctly, and Charles. This idea of intersectionality is important. Given my perch, one thing that was absent from the safeguards and identified gaps that were presented in the slides preceding this discussion was the point on age. We've seen, for example, older adults during the pandemic, and we're still continuing on with the pandemic, have been disproportionately affected, both economically, both their health and financial well-being from the pandemic, as opposed to other population segments. We see that older women have borne the brunt of caregiving responsibilities, and as a result, have had to leave the workforce. So I think there's a real opportunity here to include age among other dimensions, and to explore this intersectionality between age and gender in its inclusion among the safeguards. So I'll leave it there, but I just thank you for the opportunity to provide feedback. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will perhaps ask Samantha to come in and maybe speak a little bit to the our OP2 and how an intersectional approach is actually included, where some of the issues that you raised are being taken into account. So Sam, if you would like to come in, please.
Sure, I can have a start, and maybe Bruce or others may want to supplement. So thank you for raising the point about intersectionality. So maybe I would just explain how it currently fits within our gender approach and also broader poverty and social analysis approach. So maybe starting with gender, in our operational priority 2, or OP2, as we say colloquially, we do recognize within that a good gender analysis also considers other forms of discrimination. And so there is a dedicated paragraph within that policy document, which talks about the principle of intersectionality and the need to consider other axes of discrimination to the extent that they intersect with gender. And so what that means in practice is where the gender analysis raises issues that relate to other axes of discrimination, that should get picked up as part of the analysis and appropriately integrated into the design as appropriate with the right sort of indicators. So in practice, what that means that some departments, and they don't all follow it exactly, but some departments have what they call, I mentioned earlier, we have a tool called a gender action plan. But what that means for some departments where they want to broaden it is they will call it a gender and social inclusion action plan, because they like to integrate other indicators. It doesn't have an impact on our gender categorization system because those threshold requirements remain the same, but it allows other issues to be brought together where the analysis indicates that needs to be addressed. So that's sort of on the gender side. And that would mean that the indicators would be appropriate as well. So it doesn't detract from the very strong gender approach, but it enhances it where that analysis warrants for the need for that attention to those additional issues. So Bruce also talked about earlier a broader approach to poverty and social analysis. And that's something that it's sort of separate but complementary to our gender approach. And it also falls under a different operational priority, which is our operational priority 1, which is on broader social area. And so within that, that's where the leave no one behind general broader gender fits. And so that addresses all axes of other forms of exclusion. So sort of within that poverty and social analysis, there would be also looking at other forms of intersectionality, which sort of go beyond the gender interface. And that's where approaches would come into informing project design. So I don't know, Bruce, would you like to add anything there?
Yes, thank you, Sam. Just 2 points. But firstly, to thank our colleagues for the points that have been raised so far. I certainly agree that we need to look to both a more integrated approach, of avoiding sort of the segregation and silos or the risk of that may come in with having very distinct or separate standards that aren't very well linked. In addition, of course, to looking at the intersectionality issues that have been raised, importantly from several colleagues. So this is something that's in our mind, and the risks of having too many standards in the safeguard policy ultimately that don't link up well or end up getting siloed in the way that they're implemented is certainly an issue. We've seen that even with the existing safeguards, say between the environmental safeguard aspects and then the social safeguard aspects and involuntary resettlement and Indigenous peoples issues. We've sometimes seen that pretty good assessment work has been done on one side that hasn't been very well integrated on the other side. And so what we would like to achieve with this new policy is a much more integrated approach and have the environmental and social analysis work very closely together. And then just finally on the intersectionality aspects. So Sam just mentioned also around the approach that some in ADB are taking on linking gender to social inclusion. So that is happening. For example, our South Asia department has developed what they call a framework for gender equality and social inclusion, or GESI. That's something that they've spent quite a lot of time on developing and now piloting carefully with the countries in the region. So that's something we're looking at and want to learn from more for the policy. And I'll just come back to Vijay's comments on aging specifically. So that has been a strong focus over the last few years within our social development practice. And it's a focus on aging, elderly care, for example, as a proactive development agenda. Obviously, it's increasingly important with the aging demographic of many countries in the region where we work. So that's something we're certainly aware of. And then articulating that in the safeguards framework. So something that we're probably still grappling with and need to think more on from these consultations. Of course, you'll be giving us good recommendations, but we need to articulate very carefully around looking at intersectionality and a range of different vulnerabilities or disadvantaged groups in the context of the safeguards. So, clearly you can identify, a range of key areas: gender, disability, children, youth, elderly, for example. they all need to be identified and assessed as appropriate in a project context. But then the linkages between them also need to be brought out. So that is something we need to think a little bit more of as we design the policy. So I'll stop there and pass back to you, Sonny.
Thank you. I see that we have a few comments and one hand up, but we've been going for a little while now. So I'm going to hand it back to Azim, who will lead us into our break, and then we can come back in a few minutes to pick up on some of the comments and questions. So over to you, Azim.
Thank you very much. Having concluded part one of the Q&A session, let's now pause for a brief 5-minute break. Before we do, I just want to invite you to think about a poll evaluation question, actually 3 evaluations that are coming up after part 2 of the Q&A session. And what we have is a number of options and opportunities for stakeholders like yourselves to feedback to us and give us an idea of how these consultations can be improved. So if you could just start thinking about that now, how specifically these dialogues, consultations, and discourses can be improved to better address your needs and allow an opportunity to have much more of an open dialogue, a discourse, and even hear from your experiences if we're not doing that now, or if we can do it a bit better. We'd love to hear from you. But for now, let's pause for a break. You'll see at the top right-hand side of your screen a slide with a countdown timer in the top right-hand corner. When that countdown timer goes from 5 to approaching 0, you'll know that it's time to return and that we're about to restart. For those of you stepping away from your screen, grabbing a bit of a stretch, maybe getting a cup of tea or coffee, whatever, you'll hear some music. As that music begins to fade, you'll also know that it's time to return to your screen. So with that, we'll, leave you alone for 5 minutes, and we look forward to welcoming you back to this consultation in the next 5 minutes. See you soon. Thank you very much and welcome back. We will now have part 2 of our open discussion as continued by Zonabel Woods of the ADB. You'll see the same guide questions flashed on the screen now, but again, please feel free to also share your experiences on how the ADB can better target or improve OP2 and the gender and related safeguards issues in the revision of the 2009 Safeguards Policy Statement. A brief reminder that you can also ask questions through posting them in the chat box or through virtually raising your hand in Zoom. And a further reminder that should you wish to raise a question or share an experience anonymously, please send the message in the chat box, but instead of selecting to everyone in the chat, please select send message to either Jennifer DeBellin or Niel Aquino, or in fact, any other person on what you see as a co-host on the participants list in the Zoom call. These are members of our team working behind the scenes, and they can repost your question under their own name to protect your identity and offer you anonymity. And a reminder that we're going to have, after this second Q&A session, an event evaluation before we turn you back to Bruce Dunn to give us a wrap up and indicative next steps. So with that, let me turn it back to Zoni to take you through the Q&A session. Zonadel, if you please.
Thank you very much. Before the break, Marianne had raised her hand. So I will let you take the floor now, Marianne, to get us started in our second part of the discussion.
Hi, thank you. I am a consultant, so my focus ends up being towards sort of the deliverables and you know, how we're getting to get things implemented. And I did want to sort of ask, I know we've been discussing that there is the gender safeguards and the gender benefits, but also we were talking about integrating other items through the PSA. And one of the key things that is an issue for me, like regarding the PSA currently, is that it's not an attached document for ADB, and there's no requirement for there to be an action plan or any other. So there is an option for social to be included in the gender action plan, but there's no requirement. So for some projects that could be missed or skipped. And I guess I really more wanted to ask a question than raise a comment, and that was, in the safeguards, is there going to be like anywhere that safeguards that through the PSA is going to be captured? Like, is there going to be a community health and safety a separate safeguard document that might also include you know, the elderly and the disabled? Or is there going to be some way that we can include the poverty and social analysis to have some kind of more some requirements, some attachment to the actual project requirements, some way that we can make sure that the developer actually does what we recommend in the documents? And just sort of building on that was also one of the things that I found difficult in a recent project that I was doing was that in the gender action plan, because it's focused on outcomes and outputs, it makes it quite difficult to fit the construction phase into the gender action plan. And where are we going to capture those impacts that for some projects, for example, you know, if it was a wind farm, the construction might actually be the biggest impact on gender. You know, gender jobs, gender-based violence, things like that, that might not actually pass on to the operations phase. So those were some things that I wanted to just sort of raise. I also think it's quite important what has already been discussed about where we fit gender in the project, whether we have a standalone gender policy, or if it goes throughout the other documents. And I think that for me, the best option is both. If we can have gender included throughout the other plans and policies, and a separate gender plan. So yeah, sorry, that's my opinion. Yeah, and I just wanted to raise those other comments and questions about how we make things enforceable. How are we going to make the issues that don't fit into the current gender requirements, how do we make them also enforceable? Is that going to be through a separate safeguard document, or through somehow making the poverty and social analysis enforceable? Thank you.
Thanks, Marianne, for those very important points. I think this question might be taken up by Madhu. So Madhu, you have the floor.
Thanks, Zoni, and thanks, Marianne, for a very, very pertinent question, and the issues that you're observing, doing consultancy, in ADB projects. We have the poverty social assessment process, and you're right that we don't require it as a requirement in the RRP. So it's, having said that, is not that the process doesn't happen. Obviously, there's a lot of effort and resources and money goes into surveys, consultation process, getting in information to improve the project design, and based on the impacts and the way the project has both positive and negative ones in terms of enhancement measures and project designs. All of these happen. Now, during the SPR, the review process, we also found out that within ADB, we have many processes during project processing where we do collect a lot of information. And even under the safeguard policy statement, we also have requirement for conducting social impact assessment. And these are extremely important tools and requirements and can be strengthened. So for the poverty social assessment, ADB has technical assistance where we are trying to strengthen the poverty social assessment, as well as, as part of the SPS review, we will also actually strengthen the social impact assessment. And as you know, in the revised policy, we are looking and moving towards more performance standards. So the point that you raised on, developing, community health and safety plans, labor management plans, all of these requirements might come in, and there's a possibility that it will come in because we are also trying to harmonize with, other MFIs, their processes. So we find that the PSA process is an important tool, and also the social impact assessment. Now, the point of, whether, did SPS at all address gender elements or not? Of course we did, which we did address gender elements and gender risk relate, safeguard risks. But there wasn't much clarity in terms of the policy provisions, and we also did not follow up through with adequate guidance. So this update process is also an opportunity for us to actually incorporate specific provisions in the policy, whether it's a standalone or whether it's across the different standards. We have not come to that decision, but at least there are, proper specific provisions. Maybe, I'm saying maybe because we have not finalized or, completely, there might be linkages established between the poverty social assessment process and the requirements that we will have for the safeguards, for social safeguards at least, to establish those linkages. And that's the reason we are also talking about integrated risk assessment. We are talking about synergies between environment and social, how best we can address that at the policy level, as well as institutionally through our various operational manual procedures and different requirements. So whatever you mentioned, we have that in our radar. And I'm glad that, you, while implementing projects and doing projects for ADB, you have already identified that these are certain places where we can strengthen. So I'll stop there. And if you have any further questions, obviously, I'm very happy to respond to that.
I forgot to unmute myself. Thank you very much for that explanation, Madhu. And also, Bruce, in case some of the terminology is unfamiliar to some people, PSA is, he put it in the chat, PSA is Poverty and Social Analysis. RP is Report and Recommendations of the ADB President and the Board of Directors. And this is the this is the document that gets approved by ADB's board. So just clarification of the terminology, and apologies that we sometimes get caught up in our own lingo. So we also have a couple of comments still in the chat. So Sarah was replying to Marianne on sort of how the gap in ADB documents emerge after gender due diligence, and is prepared at planning feasibility stage with the appropriate outputs and outcomes. However, that gap is the outcome of gender assessment and gender categorization per the gender categorization guidelines. So she makes some important points about sort of how that process evolves and sort of what she sees as, you know, some of the key elements that should be taken into account, and the linkages to the different levels of the project cycle. We also have another comment or a question from an anonymous participant or anonymous question, and let me just read that out. So the question is, given its growing recognition of the issue of individuals with diverse SOGI, is ADB considering revisiting and changing its current binary definition of gender and gender equality? If yes, will a non-binary definition of gender and gender equality be included in the updated SPS? If no, why? So I will ask Sam to come in with a response to that, as well as Bruce. And we can start with that, and if others from the Safeguards team would like to also add. But over to you, Sam.
Thank you, Zoni, and thank you to whoever asked this question. Yeah, this is something that is, you know, it has been raised, and the whole issue of how we address SOGI going forward is something that we're still working through and really needs a lot of deep thought. And as Bruce mentioned, there is actually dedicated paper on this and other sessions on it. I think in a couple of weeks, maybe Bruce can remind the time frame. But I think that it's something that it's an important issue, which as an organization, we need to think about how we approach broadly, as well as in the context of safeguards. That being said, it's something that also needs quite careful consideration for a range of reasons. One, firstly, is we need to be mindful of the context that we are working on and the diversity of our developing member countries and their, I guess, broader appetite and willingness to embrace these issues. So we, you know, in some countries, there is demand and there's strong keenness to do so. On the other hand, we have some countries which are, you know, have a much more conservative approach. So I think as an organization, we need to be mindful that pursuing this as an important issue will not negatively impact an established, proactive, good approach that we have already to gender. So we need to navigate that. That's an important one. And I think also another really important consideration is the practicality of data. There's very little data on this issue, and it's very difficult to collect data on this issue. And in some contexts, it might even be illegal. So I think that in order to be able to approach this issue in an informed, sensitive way, and also in respecting privacy, we have to think about actually what data there is out there. So there are some things that we are already doing as an organization. We're starting to, linked with World Bank work, do a legal barriers study on SOGI, and that will be important analytical work to help inform our approach. So maybe I'll leave it at that, and Bruce can speak to how that relates to the actual safeguards process, perhaps, and anything else you'd like to add.
Great, thank you, Sam, and thanks very much for a participant raising this question. I was hoping it would come up so we'd have a chance to flag it a little bit more. I think Sam has already covered, quite a widespread, so I'll just add a couple of additional points. For inclusion in the updated safeguard policy statement, so it's still a work in progress, and as Sam mentioned, there is a background paper that we've been working on for a consultation. In fact, that should be going up live on our website very soon and being sent out to those of you that are on our mailing list for the consultation processes. The consultation themselves will be on the 6th and 7th of June, depending on which time zone you find appropriate to join. For us, at this stage, we have proposed tentatively for specific inclusion in the policy framework. We raised this during some sort of early briefing with our board recently on the directions, but we did flag that it's still an area that needs further discussion through the consultation processes and with civil society and our developing member countries. So we need to see how that goes. But I think from our project team's intent, we recognize it as a critical issue. We've been discussing, for example, today in this consultation around intersectionality issues, and it's clearly an important issue in its own right. And then you have intersectionality with a range of other issues such as poverty, relationships that often come in for people of different sexual orientation and gender identity, can be marginalized, can have less opportunities for education, healthcare, for example, which can put them in a differential, lower poverty situation. So we're aware of those issues, but as Samantha said, we need to go through and develop a framework that can be implementable in the region. And also, I think something that's in the back of my mind and we need to develop carefully is in countries where you do have legal barriers, and Sam mentioned the studies there, being able to implement in a way that is safe for people that could be put at further risk. So, how do we do that practically? It's an agenda that obviously needs to be pushed, but the practical side we need to think through very carefully. So I'll stop there, and happy to have further points either in this session or in particular in the session coming up on the 6th and 7th of June.
Thank you, Bruce and Sam. And perhaps in the chat box, we can also include the link for signing up to the next week's session, and also maybe the issues paper, so people can have an opportunity to also look at that. We have a couple of, they're not so much questions as comments from Brenda. So just acknowledging that they are there in terms of gender and as an overarching principle of safeguards. And then I don't see any other comments or questions. We're coming to the end of our time for Q&A. But Brenda, did you want to come in to expand on sort of the two comments that you've made? Okay. I don't see you.
Hi. So sorry, but I'm sorry. I had a problem with the Zoom,
Okay. Hi, welcome.
Zooming out. Thank you. Yeah, it was just raising the issue that safeguards are very important. The gender is an element of safeguards is very, very important because the effect can be long term. So if the effects could be long term, So the safeguards plan should still be within the radar of concern of gender people. It should not be left alone with the safeguards team. And so it is important to have a very strong relation and coordination with safeguards team, because the gender effects of safeguards, for example, involuntary resettlement, can be long-term. But of course, we all know what gender as an overarching principle of safeguards is. So that's why my focus was more on gender as an element, as one of the safeguards, to consider. On the second comment on the intersectionality, and we know I was also a safeguards consultant, and in some of the projects of SARD, I also helped, and during review missions. So I see some issues related to safeguards, and I see really that the most disadvantaged by safeguards issues are women and girls of disadvantaged groups. And Bruce has already mentioned this. So for example, older women with disabilities, and other types of disadvantages. So this is a matter that we need to give important attention to. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Sanibel. That's it.
Thank you very much, Brenda. We have never met, but I've seen your name over the years as one of our most experienced gender specialists. So it's really nice to see you, although it's via Zoom. And thank you so much for your comments.
Thank you, Sanibel.
Yeah, so we also have, just as a follow-up comment from our earlier comment, that the person would like for this to be considered, I guess, in the record and among our comments, for ADB to be proactive in considering SOGI and safeguards if it is conservative in defining gender. Please consider this as a comment. Thanks. So we'll thank you for that. We'll definitely include it in our comments from this consultation. So I don't see any other comments in the chat. So if just one last call, if anyone has sort of a final message for ADB on this consultation on gender and safeguards, now is the time, but of course, you're always welcome to send us your comments in writing as well. But if there's a burning issue that you'd like to raise now, just one last call. I don't see any comments in the chat or anyone raising their hand. So I'll hand it over to Azim now. Thank you very much for all the great questions and for your perspectives and for sharing your experiences with us today. Over to you, Azim.
And thank you too, Zonibel. Thanks, Samantha Hung, Malika Shagozatova, Zainab Al-Badri, Madhumita Gupta, and Bruce Dunn, as well as others, including those from the events management and SEP teams who've been working tirelessly behind the scenes. A warm and heartfelt thanks, but of course, a big and special thanks to you, our participants and informants, for raising your insightful comments, the clarity of your questions, the sharing of experiences, and the constructive feedback. And I'd like to reiterate once again that the comments on the study on gender in Asia and the Pacifics that are received from this consultation and hereafter will be considered in the final study report, which will in turn inform the revision of ADB's standard and updating of the safeguards policy statement. But please don't go just yet. On your screen, please give us your feedback. I mentioned that this would be coming previously. Impulsively, on a scale of 1 to 5, please rate your level of satisfaction with this particular consultation, 5 being the most satisfied and 1 being the least satisfied. You can just tap that into your screens or onto your handheld devices now. Keyboards and handheld devices now. And we'd like to feed that back to you, the results of what you've typed in, in the next 10 or 15 seconds. So your quick impressions on how satisfied you were with this particular consultation. In the chat box, you will see 2 further HTML links to surveys that we've got. The first is a menti.com poll, and that breaks down and disaggregates why you were satisfied or your level of satisfaction with this particular consultation. If you have specific inputs on how we can improve the level of discourse, engagement, and discussion in these events, we'd like to hear from you. We'd like to hear what worked. We'd like to hear what may have not worked so well and what we can improve on. So that's the menti.com poll, and the link to that is in the chat box. And as well, the post-event evaluation survey on whether or not these consultations have met and addressed your needs and given you, the stakeholders, an opportunity to voice your views, concerns, share your experiences, and engage with the ADB in a meaningful way and try and unpack what it means, what the study on gender in Asia and the Pacific actually means, and how that can be or will be carried forward into the revision and the updating of the safeguards policy statement. So those 2 polls you can fill out at your own discretion and leisure anytime after this. But what we'd like now is the results of the Zoom poll on a scale of 1 to 5. How satisfied are you with today's session? So overwhelmingly, 73% said highly satisfied, and about a quarter said somewhat satisfied. The net result is 100% are either somewhat or highly satisfied. We understand and appreciate that there's room and an opportunity for improvement, and we want to know what specific opportunities and rooms for improvement we can take on board for the remaining consultations. So if you could give us that feedback, we'd be very, very grateful. And of course, Bruce and others have relayed to you the remainder of the consultation schedule for the rest of these sessions. I'd now like to bring you back to the Director of SDCC and this overall process, Mr. Bruce Dunn, to give us a summary of what we've heard from you and walk us through the next steps after this consultation. Bruce, could you please review the discussions and our next steps going forward?
Great, thank you very much, Azim, and huge thanks to everyone that's joined today for sharing really valuable comments, questions, recommendations. It really contributes to our thinking and highlighting key issues that we need to look at as we try and develop a better policy. And of course, thinking through the issues that will be important for implementation. So I really appreciated it. Just a quick summary of some of the key issues that we did cover now. For time, I won't go through everything comprehensively, but just to highlight a few issues. Certainly, of course, well recognized that the risks to women and girls are a key issue that needs to be addressed in the safeguards. And of course, we need to look at the risk management aspects in the safeguards, but there is also the wider proactive approach to strengthening gender equality in the region that's supported by ADB's gender and development policy, and then our operational priority on gender equality. So that's really a critical aspect, actually, for ADB's overall program. In fact, gender is one of the key areas that we have targets on for ADB, so we need to really look at it carefully in the context of the safeguards. Then secondly, to say, while we have that proactive agenda, and then we have the safeguards looking at the risks, I think one of the aspects that comes out of a consultation like this and that we need to look at more carefully is the linkages between those. And there are some shared processes like the poverty and social analysis work that has been mentioned today. Of course, there's also linkages between, understanding what are the opportunities in a project or in project design for strengthening gender equality and inclusion, and also some of the risk management measures. And you want to make sure also that you're not inadvertently losing opportunities through that process. So that's something we need to look at. few other points that came out in terms of recommendations. One is that we need to look at how we can strengthen the analysis of gender issues, links to the poverty and social analysis process. Also that we need to look carefully at intersectionality issues. There's a broad range of vulnerable and disadvantaged individuals and groups, poor people, of course, women and children that we've been talking about today, also more broadly youth, senior citizens and the elderly, and then explicitly we had in the consultation raised around people of different sexual orientation and gender identity. And a range of others, of course. So that needs to be considered comprehensively. We're looking at having more explicit focus in the environmental and social assessment process to poor, vulnerable and disadvantaged groups and considering those intersectionality issues. So that's certainly something that we're looking at. Also, a recommendation is that gender needs to be considered actually not just for the safeguards as a whole, but individually in various different standards, for example, around labour. So we're looking at having a separate standard on labour and working conditions in the new safeguards. We didn't really get into the details of that today, but you know, obviously gender dimensions there. Also in community health and safety, also for resettlement processes. In each of the standards, essentially, we need to look at gender differentiated impacts and how we would be able to manage those. Then moving forward, policy is one thing, but implementation, guidance and capacity is really going to be critical for this process. And I think that's an area where we will continue to seek for resources so that we can support implementation more effectively. And there's a couple of things that didn't come up today or in this consultation right now, but in an earlier consultation that we ran this morning, Asia time, was on strengthening some of the metrics, the indicators that are needed to be able to show that we're effectively looking at gender through consultation processes and at the outcome level. So there's a lot for us to work through, but you've helped us to articulate a number of points, and we'll certainly be taking that very seriously looking ahead. Now, in terms of next steps, Azim has mentioned some of this, but I'll just briefly highlight a few key points. There'll be further consultations on gender topics. We're doing sessions with civil society, but through this week, we'll also be having consultations with our developing member countries. Then next week, we've got sessions on sexual exploitation, abuse and harassment. And then the week after, as I mentioned, on the SOGI issues. We're also going to be running some additional consultations as part of this regional series. We've still got topics to come around how we apply the safeguards for different financing modalities. For example, our work with financial intermediaries or with corporate finance. So that's coming up in June, and also looking at our private sector operations. Then we'll be moving a little bit into the next stage. We'll be having follow-up consultations in a number of our developing member countries. So we'll be doing missions to have more specific consultations with governments, and then local civil society. We'll be initially working through 10 countries. Plus we have consultations with project affected people. That's a special feature that we're adding into this process, and we'll be looking at 10 projects that are either under implementation or have been completed, some of which have had complaints, and we're going to be looking very carefully at how the safeguards process was implemented and what can directly affected people tell us about how we can improve that process. So there are a few things that are coming up over the next few months. In parallel to that, we're just starting the process to draft the new standards. And once we've got a draft available, which we expect by about September or October this year, we'll then be making that public, and we'll do then further consultations. So still a lot to do for our team. We're pretty busy, but we're very much looking forward to further engagement with you. So, really greatly appreciate your engagement, particularly some of you that have sustaining the effort, sort of coming in week by week for these various different topics. That's really great. So again, thank you very much, and look forward to speaking to you again. And till then, take care. Thank you.